No alien card, no passport, no flight home. We own you. The Midnight Runner.
Serving teachers and expats in South Korea and beyond, we are the Midnight Runner podcast. Today's show will be very interesting for you if you're a teacher, because our guest, his name is Thomas, by the way, first arrived to teach in Korea way back in 1984. I'm sure you'll agree that's a pretty long time ago. I was just a snot-nosed middle schooler back then. 25 years ago, however, Thomas arrived in Korea to teach at a private high school. With the exception of a 5-year break in between, Thomas has been here ever since. He's married, raised a child, and currently teaches at a university. Stay tuned to learn more about what life was like for him in his early days, what it was like raising a biracial child in Korea, and much, much more. Don't click away. Keep us running in the background while you surf the web. We are the Midnight Runner Podcast.
We don't hold hands, and we don't wear couple shirts. We are the Midnight Runner.
Do you know? Do you know? The Soul Podcast.
Hello. Is this Doctor?
Joe McPherson.
So a lot of people call this a beer gut. I call this a battery for a love-making machine.
Jennifer Young.
Yeah, I don't think they even told him to stop drinking. I think they were just like, don't burn down any more national monuments, dude.
Stafford Lumsden.
The number one top international crisis that no one really gives a shit about.
And the great King Sejong.
Damn straight.
The Soul Podcast.
The international hub of podcasting.
And welcome back to the Midnight Runner podcast. Today our special guest is Thomas, and he's been in Korea for 25 years on and off, and he's taught English here. And wow, he's experienced so many things. I thought it would be great to have him on the show. Hello, Thomas. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. Thank you very much for inviting me here.
Hey, I'm glad you're here. Why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself and tell us why you came to Korea?
Okay, well, as mentioned, I first came to Korea 25 years ago, back in 1984. A year earlier than that, I met a man who had started a high school in Korea back in 1960, and, well, that was really fascinating to me. I was young, single, and recently laid off from the fledgling personal computer industry, and I thought that coming to teach at a foreign high school for a change of pace seemed like a good idea.
And what kind of computers were you involved in 1984?
Well, back then, they were the CBMs, the Commodore Business Machines. Today, we'd probably think of them as high-tech boat anchors.
Very similar to my Commodore 64, I would imagine, that I had when I was in, I think, middle school.
Oh, yeah. Well, I serviced some of those, too.
That sounds like fun. Well, when you arrived in Korea, what was it like? You got off the plane, you looked around. I imagine you arrived at Gimpo Airport back then because Incheon wasn't built at that time, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, landed at Gimpo, and when I finally found the person who was supposed to be picking me up, we drove into Seoul, and it was quite an experience. I mean, even back in 1984, it was a very, very large city.
Did they have the subway system back then?
Oh, yeah, they did. As a matter of fact, the first couple of days I was in Korea, I took the subway all the way on over to Incheon.
Did you learn Korean quickly?
Well, before I first came to Korea, I learned the alphabet, Hangul, and such. One thing that was really important to me was not to learn Hangul using the Roman alphabet. To me, it was very important to learn Hangul using Hangul. That served me well. But very honestly, I never really became extremely fluent in Korea. Some people find that strange. You know, I've lived here for so many years and I'm not fluent. But the thing was, I lived in the very provincial city of Gyeongju, you know, which was the ancient capital of the Shilla Kingdom. And being such a small provincial city, there was essentially no opportunity to learn Korean in a structured way. So I had to kind of learn it myself, and I did on and off. But people always wanted to practice their English, you know, kind of like what they do today. So it was really easy to fall into a rut of just speaking English with people.
And you could get by really well just reading signs in Hangul because a lot of them, well, these days anyway, turn out to be English. Was it the same back then? Were there signs written in Korean that could be read as English, essentially?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of signs that had English on them. They had a lot of grammatical and spelling problems. And, of course, back in 84, they had so many different ways of trying to Romanize things that I really am glad that I learned how to read and write Korean using Hangul. It made a very big difference doing it that way.
Well, were there many foreigners teaching here in Korea back in 1984?
Not that many, especially in my city of Gyeongju. I think for the longest time I was the only one. You literally could have sent a letter to the foreigner, Gyeongju, Korea, and I would have received it. It was really a very different situation. The rest of the country, there were a few, but teaching regulations were very different then from today, and back then it was unusual for a school to have a foreign conversation teacher. So it was a lot different.
How are the students today compared to what they were back then?
Actually, the students back then were a lot more serious than they are today, and the reason why I say that is because back in that generation, the families, for one thing, the families were larger, so there were more students per family, and education, except for elementary school, education was all tuition-based, and families didn't have a lot of money, and not enough money even to put food on the table for their families, but for the people in their family, but yet they would go into great debt to send children to school. So the children, I think back then, took their education a lot more seriously than they do today. The economy today is loads better than it was back then, and so it isn't such a burden on the families like it used to be.
Well, that's interesting. Did you see a lot of farming communities as opposed to today? Were there more farming communities back then?
Oh, yeah. Farming was a lot more prevalent back then. And I forget what the percentages are. I do remember seeing them, but it's decreased significantly in the last 25 years. Back then, things that have changed, people always are asking me, what kind of changes have I seen? Back then, it was very common to see fields being plowed with oxen. Whereas, today you have the Gyeongungi, the little rototiller-like tractor that kind of seconds, I think, for the family vehicle on weekends or something. You didn't see a lot of that because the farm families didn't have a lot of money, so their oxen were multi-purpose, and plowing fields was one of the biggest things you'd see.
And sometimes they sold the cow to pay for the education, right, of the children.
They sold whatever they had. It was a time when families here in Korea, where families really would put off doing one thing to make sure that their children had the education that they needed.
Well, my students still talk about having to sell the family cow to pay for their university education, and there's still kind of a joke around here about how many cows it takes. Did they measure miniskirts and haircuts in the streets back in 1984, or was that something from prior to that period?
Well, I really didn't see that myself. I do know of it. I know that back in the 70s, anyway, it was kind of a big thing to do. However, guy students' hair was still measured in schools, I know. I remember seeing a student whose hair went beyond the maximum length. He was forcibly held over a trash can by the high school gym teacher while another teacher gave him a rototiller cut.
Was there a lot of abuse in schools back then?
Probably what in the West we might consider to be that, yeah. The teachers could be very harsh to students, and corporal punishment was the rule of the time.
I worked with a Korean teacher at a former high school job, and he told me that when he was a student, he had said something inappropriate to the teacher, and the teacher hit him with a closed fist and knocked him out. So,
yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, some of those things used to go on. These days, it's not such an issue, but of course, things come up from time to time.
Yeah.
Well, in your eyes, how has the Korean lifestyle changed since 1984?
First thing that comes to my mind is the automobile. Back in '84, there were few cars in Korea, and one reason is there wasn't much of a middle class. Most people were considered to be lower class, and there were some small percentage who were considered to be rich. So for the most part, the people who had cars were taxi drivers and rich people. And on a side note, the taxis even then drove like madmen.
Yeah,
so
that's something
that
do.
That hasn't changed.
Wow. So were the roads a lot less used, or were there just fewer roads back then, I imagine?
There were fewer roads. A lot of the roads were unpaved. They were little more than 2 tracks in many cases.
In the city, even?
Oh yeah. Where I lived, I would probably say half of the roads were unpaved 2 tracks. And that's the reason why when you go to a lot of places here in Korea, a lot of the streets go in all different directions. They don't necessarily follow compass direction like what we see in most Western cities. There are streets that were made right where the old cart paths and footpaths used to be.
Well, what was it like shopping? Were there little Majoms down the street, or did you happen to have anything like a Home Plus or a Costco or anything like that, an E-Mart around? Yeah,
the Maejum, Pyeonijum, they were back then. They were just as common as they are now. You had at least 1 or 2 on just about right around every street corner and such. However, getting things from the if you wanted something that was Western, it was very, very difficult to do. If you wanted that, you had to generally go to a big city. Like for me, it would have been, like Busan, Daegu, or even up to Seoul or something, and visit a black market. And because of that, I rarely had Western food. If I wanted Western food, I would find a way of getting myself invited onto a U.S. military base and eat one of their fast foods or something like that. For the most part, however, I ate Korean food, which fortunately I like a lot.
And you probably got used to, because you told me earlier that you lived with a Korean family when you came. Is that right?
Well, as a matter of fact, it was my wife's family.
Explain that, because you didn't meet her overseas, right?
No, I didn't. Well, my wife and I, we were both teachers at the same high school, and before I came to Korea, I was in. She had invited me to board with her family, and so when I came to Korea, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know the country. I didn't know the language, of course, or anything. And so
she invited you. Did you mean just she did that as a friendly gesture because she knew you were a foreigner coming to this country?
Well, actually, I back up just a little bit. For 1 year before I came to Korea, she was my pen pal.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, because I wanted to write to somebody on the faculties who I could get to know the school and the city and the country and everything from. And so when I came to Korea, she became my guide, my interpreter, and my best friend. And I
How
do
was
have to
her
say,
English in those early stages?
Pretty good. I mean, better than most. And today, I would call her exceptional. But anyway, yeah, she and I we worked together very closely, lived together very closely, and I do have to say that after 25 years of marriage, she's still my best friend.
That's important too.
It is.
That's important. My mother always told me that the reason her my father and her were still together was because they're best friends and they have fun together. And
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
what it takes. Well, tell me more about your family, and especially when you came here. When you first moved into their home, they had some brothers. She had some brothers and sisters, right?
Yes, she has 3 brothers and 2 sisters.
And what was it like living together with them? Did they want to talk to you right away, or were they extremely shy of this foreigner? You know, they didn't see many foreigners back then, so.
Yeah, well, actually, except for her, all of her siblings had moved out, either to work or school or whatever the case might be. So she was the only one still living at home. But however, I would see her brothers and sisters. I saw them frequently, and we all got along really well, and still do. And I think of them as my own brothers and sisters.
Did they speak English as well?
Actually, only my wife's youngest brother was really an English speaker.
What about your wife's father? Did he speak any English?
Not really. He knew a few words, but that was really about it. However, he was a really nice man. He died several years ago, but I enjoyed spending time with him. He tried to teach me Hanja, Chinese characters, wow. And so we spent time every day working on characters and such like that.
When you were with your wife around town, and you later began dating, I guess that's how it would have worked. Mm-hmm. Did you get any strange looks from people in the community?
Oh, yeah. But I would have to say that a lot of most of the cases, the looks were just generally curiosity. For one thing, my wife and I never really went into public displays of affection or anything. We kind of stuck with the Korean way of doing things on the outside.
And it was a lot more conservative back then as well, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It was a very, very conservative society back then. We're right on. At that point, it was just really the tail end of traditional society. It was just starting to get into the industrialized country that Korea became and such at that time. So, yeah, there were looks, but rarely did we ever have any problems. There's only really 1 or 2 times that I can remember where somebody actually lashed out at us because of our walking together and such.
Did they say something rude to you in Korean or try to split you up? What was that? Do you remember?
Well, the one situation that I remember quite vividly is my wife and I were walking down one street, and these guys came out of a bar, quite plastered, and one of them he just went into a verbal tirade at my wife, saying just really, really nasty things, and he expected her to just go on and take it, but she stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, went right up to him face to face, and she outdid him in the shouting department, and it ended up his friends dragging him away.
Maybe he thought you were a soldier or something like that.
Well, I suppose, even though I didn't have especially short hair or anything, but who knows?
Let's talk more about the wedding. We haven't talked about that before. Did you get married in a wedding hall, or was it a church situation?
Actually, yeah, got married in a church, which was fairly unusual here in Korea. Most everybody just got married in a wedding hall, but we had our ceremony was all in Korean wedding clothes. We didn't go for the white dress or anything like that of the West. We did all traditional clothing, which we bought them, and I still own them. We have they're back in the States at my folks' place.
Drag them out of the closet once in a while, wear them around the house.
Yeah. Well, actually, we only wore them one other time, and that was when we had a ceremony for my family back in the States.
Well, that's very interesting. We did the wedding, and we just wore traditional Western clothing, although we got married in a Korean wedding hall. And we opted not to do the Korean traditional clothing just because they tack on a fair share more for doing that. So we thought we'd save a little bit of money, and my wife wasn't really in love with the idea anyway, so we were good to go with that.
Well, I one thing about Korean weddings and it's the same today as it was back then, are the attendants. They're always getting in the way.
Oh, yeah. Did you ever notice really amazed me. And it was kind of nice because I was clueless as to what to do. There's really no rehearsal. Maybe your church did, but the wedding hall I went to, we had no rehearsal at all. And Koreans, they probably see 50 of these things in their lifetime and they know what to expect. But I was mortified because I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. But I had these 2 or 3 attendant ladies walking around, pulling on my clothes. At one time, they pulled my pants up, much to the delight of my father. He got quite a laugh out of that one. But they're always adjusting you, turning you around, moving you around, etc. It's quite interesting, to say the least.
Well, and when I look back on our wedding albums and such, looking at these attendants and all the pictures, I started to wonder who it was I actually married.
Well, you had a son together, is that right?
Yes, we have one son.
And how old is he now?
Now he's Western age. This year he will be 22, so 23 Korean age.
And he has a very unique educational background. We talked about that before. Could you tell us about that?
Well, he went to a Korean elementary school. All the 6 years of elementary school, he was very popular there. Every year he was class president, and in the 6th year he was the student body president. We didn't send him to any middle or high schools in Korea because my wife especially felt that those schools wasted too much time, with a lot of it spent on punishments for infractions that were either real or imagined, and too little time was actually spent on education. So because of that, she homeschooled him. After the first year, he took a proficiency exam and he passed middle school, and a bit later he took another proficiency exam and he passed high school. He then took a university entrance test at the Western age of 14, and for a few years he was the youngest person in Korea to have qualified for the university.
Sounds brilliant.
Well, people say oh, genius and such, and he is a very bright kid, but both he and I like to credit his mother for a lot of this. She's a very determined Korean mother. Still is. He was accepted by both Hanyang University and Gyeongbuk University, but however, at the time, his mother and I felt he was too young to live, a typical university student's life in a dorm and such like that, far away from home. And so because of that, he studied with the Open Cyber University, which is a consortium of colleges and universities all across the country. He graduated from there at the top of his class, and then after that he went to Busan National University's graduate school. He studied linguistics, received his master's degree from there a year ago, and for the past year he's been working on his PhD in practical applied linguistics up in Seoul.
So his long-term goal is to be a professor?
Who knows? Actually, if he had his way, he'd be an electric guitarist.
Does he have a girlfriend right now?
Not that I know of, but then again, he doesn't always impart that information to me.
Well, I know that my students certainly don't want to tell their parents anything about who they're dating. I don't know what the situation is with your son. Do you have more of a Korean traditional style father-son relationship, or is it a Western style one? How does that work out?
Well, I don't know which way to really say it's styled after, but actually my son and I we've always had a very close relationship. For one thing, he and I, especially when he was a lot younger, before he had to start cracking the books, we did a lot of things together. We practiced Korean traditional archery together, and he's a lot better than I am. And we've just always always done a lot of things together, and we've had a fairly open and close relationship as father and son.
How did you handle your son's language education as far as English and Korean were concerned?
Well, actually, it turned out to be fairly natural in how that happened, because I spoke almost exclusively in English to him, and his mother probably speaks, I don't know, maybe 95% of the time anyway, she speaks to him in Korean. So as he was growing up, there really wasn't this differentiation between the English language and the Korean language. There was just to him language. Matter of fact, I remember when he was a lot younger, and he and I would fly on planes back and forth between here and the States, and he'd be talking to me in English, and then some ajuma or ajashi, would sit next to him in another seat, and he would just, without even missing a beat, he would start talking to that person in Korean, and then look back at me and start talking to me in English again. So,
were they shocked to see this child speaking to them in Korean?
Probably, but I don't know. But for him, it's always been a fairly natural thing, and for that reason, he does a lot with the language. He does book translations between Korean and English.
So he's fully fluent now between the two.
Oh yeah. He's completely bilingual, bicultural.
Fabulous. Did you ever think of having him learn another language like Chinese?
Well, actually, in his doctoral studies, which is the practical applied linguistics, there is a requirement for learning other languages, and I think that just naturally he will be picking up a lot of Chinese and Japanese, because he has tried to learn those before. But I guess one language that he's being recommended to learn is French. So,
wow. Well, that's
so.
Great.
Anyway, we'll see how that goes.
My wife speaks Japanese, English, Korean. I'm always amazed at how she can pick things up, and I struggle so much with learning the Korean. I'm sure you can relate to that.
I can relate greatly.
Well, let's talk about some other questions that we had from users on ESLcafe.com. What personal and professional development have you done since you began teaching here?
Well, my area of interest is Korean history, and I received my master's degree in Korean studies with a concentration in history. I'm currently working on my PhD in the same area. In the area of English education, although I never went for formal TESOL or TEFL certification, I have always tried to keep abreast of what's going on. And I guess another thing is I was a founding member of KOTISOL.
Really?
Yeah, I was a member of the predecessor AETK, the Association of English Teachers in Korea, before that. And matter of fact, I was even the founding webmaster for KOTISOL. I started their website for them. But at that time, it was before websites were very common at all. And so I kept it on borrowed server space at a community college in my hometown in Michigan.
And you were back home for a time between 1984 and now, correct?
Yeah. After my wife and I got married, I had really only intended to stay in Korea, for a year teaching at the high school that she and I taught at. And it was towards the end of that year that she and I were married. And after that, we moved to the States. And I taught in a community college. Taught industrial technology in a community college back in my home state. And then we returned to Korea back in 1989 along with our then 2-year-old son.
Do you count that experience as a really good one, living in the United States, then coming back?
I think, yeah, it was a good experience. For one thing, I really enjoyed the teaching that I did back in Michigan, and I think it was important for my son to have spent first couple of years anyway back in the States, and also for my wife to have experienced living in the States. She personally, she doesn't she doesn't like Michigan winters, which is one of the reasons she doesn't go back very often. But other than that, but she still has a lot of good memories of it, though.
Well, what about the current economic crisis? You've been in Korea a long time, so you went through IMF, and now we're going through another crisis. How do they compare?
Well, yeah, I was here during the '97 economic crisis. I survived. I remember many people at that time, they were jumping ship, but I had absolutely no intention of doing so. And just a couple days before the economic collapse, my wife had the good sense to send some money to the States, so I sent $5,000, which turned out to be a good idea, because after that...
It was a lot more money back then, probably. Well, I guess not too long ago, but it was more.
It was, and then, right after the collapse, my salary was essentially cut in half. But compared to the dollar. But as we lived on the Korean economy up to that time, the crash really didn't affect us greatly. There were price increases and things like that, but we just adjusted. I would say that this time around, really isn't any different as far as adjusting. Those people who have to pay for things in their home countries, it's going to be really uncomfortable, and they're going to have some belt tightening and such. But my recommendation would be to do similar to what I did, which was, one, I got rid of my debt as quickly as possible, especially credit cards. And, you have a great feeling when you do that. Then you can just concentrate about, living here in this economy, and you don't have to worry about the exchange rates quite as much.
Yeah, and what usually goes down comes back up again.
It does.
Last summer, I took home about the same amount of money and put it in the bank, and I turned out to bringing it back over just for the fact that the exchange rate was around 14 or 1,450 to the dollar. And I thought, well, I can make some money off that, because I know that in a year, 2 or 3 years, it's going to bounce back. So take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, and the exchange rates have changed a lot since '84.
Yeah, and what was the won to the dollar back then?
I think it was 500 and something.
Wow, yeah, it's definitely made a change.
Yeah.
Do you remember some prices of anything from back in '84?
To be honest, really not.
Could you go out to eat and eat for like chonwon or something like that, or? Oh
yeah, sure. Yeah. Actually, you could do pretty well. I just don't remember specifics at all. But I do remember. Yeah, it was fairly easy to do so. But then again, the cost of living was different. The annual salaries of people, was a lot different back then. Matter of fact, as a teacher, I got 500,000 won a month. That was my pay. Which, of course, today people, if somebody said they're going to give you that today, people would just, really laugh at them and walk away. But back then, that was actually pretty good pay.
Sure. Well, it'd be equal to about, 1.5 today, 1.4. So, yeah, it's a little less than what it would be. But you had your housing expenses essentially covered, right?
Yeah, pretty much. It was my wife's parents were very reasonable.
Did they make you pay some rent?
Just a little bit. I think it was 30,000 a month
for the rent, not the utilities.
Everything was included.
Oh, fabulous! Wish I could get that rate today.
Well, but then again, for utilities, you got to. We lived in her parents had a Korean Hanokjip in the middle of downtown Gyeongju. It's not there anymore. That's been knocked down. There's an office building there now. But they had a traditional house. It was a traditional neon, the L-shaped house, and it had for utilities. We had an outhouse in the middle of the courtyard.
What about heating? I mean, they had ondol, but was it the current style with the hot water going through the pipes under the floor, or was it an older style?
No. It was. This was using Yuntan.
What is that? Explain that for us?
The yuntan, there's the compressed charcoal briquettes with the holes in them.
Ah.
And it was a very, very traditional type of ondol heating, the floor heating, where you have the flue that goes under the floor that heats it. Now, the thing was, the room that I had was the one that was just next to what's in Korean is called an agungi, which is the firebox. And that's the hottest place in the house. And my father-in-law, he really wanted to be nice to me, so at nighttime he stoked it really high. And the thing being, I not only was sleeping on a thick yo mattress, and I had an extremely thick ibul blanket that was filled with silk thread and everything like that. It was really, really thick. And I would have been just fine like that, but when he turned that up, I was having, dreams of being a roasted pig.
Well, maybe he didn't like you. The king, in the olden days, if you tried to kill the king, the punishment was they would put you in a house and they would turn the heat up and basically cook you to death in the house. So maybe there was something subliminal going on there.
Well, but yeah, well, you never know. But in actually in Korean culture, traditionally, let's say you go into a room that's filled with people sitting around. The seat of honor is the one that is closest to the agungi, the hottest seat, and traditionally the person who's in charge of whatever it is would try to give the guest of honor that seat.
That's really interesting. I had no idea about that.
Yeah, I was really happy to not be the guest of honor.
Well, how long does it take to burn through one of those charcoal briquette things? What do you call those again?
That's the yuntan.
Yuntan? How long does it take to burn through one of those?
Very honestly, I'm not really sure. I never. I'd have to ask my wife. She used to when she was growing up. That was one of her duties, was to go and change out the yuntan whenever they were getting down towards the end.
Interesting. I've seen those at places where you can eat bulgogi or something. They're gonna cook. And I just thought that's what they were for. I thought they were just for cooking, but they used to actually heat the houses with those.
Oh, yeah. They were used for all kinds of heating.
I had to ask my wife some more about that. I'm kind of curious now. We have a small smokestack, actually, in our old villa that we live in now. Mm-hmm. And it's all been disconnected, but I'm sure there was some kind of system like that before.
There probably was.
Sure. Well, let's get back to talking about teaching.
Okay.
What would be the biggest advice you could give a newbie, somebody coming here from overseas for the first time to teach in Korea?
Well, I would say my biggest advice is do your homework. Make sure you know what you're getting yourself into here in Korea, culturally, linguistically, socially, everything. Because I think a lot of problems that people have is they hear about all the good money to be had over here and such, and they just hop on a plane, come over, and then it's like, wow, what happened? So if people haven't spent a great deal of time away from their home, I recommend they get some of that experience first, maybe more locally. And another thing is, I would say, don't expect Koreans to change their culture to suit them. When they get to Korea, they should get involved with some activities that might interest them or such, because Koreans really appreciate it when people who are visitors to the country take an interest in things Korean. So that would be a very good way, I think, to help them get acclimated and kind of fit in with the country a little better.
Well, how often do you get to go back home to the States?
Well, I used to go back twice a year during the summer and winter breaks, but for the past few years, I've just gone back once a year, mostly in the summertime. Biggest reason is my wife. She was really always kind of unhappy when I would just kind of take up get up and take off and head back to the States for a while. And she's stuck back here, busy doing her work and such.
Does your son go back with you these days?
Recently, he hasn't. The last couple of years, he hasn't because his studying and work schedules are a lot different from mine.
Well, currently you're teaching at a university, right?
Yes, I am.
And how long have you been teaching at the university level now?
Well, ever since I returned to Korea back in '89. And then, as I said, I taught for a few years in a community college back in my home state of Michigan. I taught at one university for 14 years. And then the last one I taught there for 4 years. But right now I'm just starting at a new one this semester.
Will you have tenure?
No.
Would you like tenure?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are good points about it and such, but also there are also a lot of restrictions. A lot of things do change. Some of my colleagues did take tenure and such, but I think that after I finish my PhD and such, after that point, then we'll see about that.
Has it been hard for you to see people come and go from Korea? That's been tough for me. I've made friends and they're here for usually less than a year, maybe even 1 or 2 years, and then they go away and, you keep in touch by email or whatnot, but it's just not the same. Has that been hard for you?
Not really. Actually, I would have to say that most of my Western friends that I've had here in Korea, they're still here in Korea.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show today.
Oh, well, thank you very much for asking me.
Sure. And do you have any parting thoughts?
Well, I would just say that if anybody ever wants to know any more about how Korea was in the past or something, I can be found on Dave's ESL Cafe. My handle is Blue Lake. Just drop me a private message or something, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Well, it sounds great. We've appreciated having you here today.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me.